The courtroom was thick with tension, the air so dense it felt like the walls were closing in. Not a single breath was wasted, not a single word spoken, just the oppressive silence of anticipation. At the center of it all, Officer Jonathan Bryant stood with his shoulders squared, his uniform crisp, and his expression unreadable. His icy blue eyes, void of remorse, locked onto the woman in the judge's seat as if she had no right to be there. As if her authority was something he refused to acknowledge. Judge Ian Williams knew that look. She had seen it countless times before, the gaze of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. A man who had never been forced to answer for his actions. A man who expected submission from every room he walked into. But today, in her courtroom, that was not going to happen. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Officer, take your seat." He didn't move. Instead, he let out a slow, mocking chuckle, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then, he leaned forward and spoke, his tone laced with venom. "I don't take orders from people like you." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The room stiffened. People shifted in their seats, casting nervous glances at each other. The weight of his statement pressed against every person in attendance. Judge Williams had been in this position before. She had dealt with men like Bryant her entire life. She knew their tactics, their arrogance, their belief that the law bent around them. But she wasn't here to play games. "This is a court of law," she said, her voice even but unyielding. "You will sit down, or you will be removed." His smirk widened. "I'd love to see you try." Then it happened. It was so sudden, so violent, that the sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. His fist struck her face. The force snapped her head to the side. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Papers scattered as people jumped to their feet in shock. Bryant stepped back, his chest heaving, his expression unreadable, as if he had just corrected some mistake the world had made. As if striking her was justified. Judge Williams stumbled, but she did not fall. No, she wouldn't give him that. She slowly lifted her head, her fingers brushing the blood from her lip, and locked eyes with him once again. At that moment, the room was no longer watching a victim. They were watching a storm about to break. Bryant's confidence flickered, just for a second. Maybe he expected her to cry. Maybe he thought she would crumble beneath the weight of what he had just done. But instead, she straightened her robe, inhaled deeply, and reached for the gavel. Not to restore order. To deliver justice. Her voice, sharp as steel, sliced through the chaos. "Officer Bryant," she said, her tone clear, unshaken. "You just assaulted a sitting judge in a court of law." The room froze. Bryant took a step forward as if he was about to speak, but before he could, she raised her hand. "Bailiffs," she commanded. "Arrest him." For the first time since he walked into that courtroom, uncertainty flickered in Bryant's eyes. The officers hesitated. They glanced at each other, their instincts battling against years of conditioning, years of being told that men like Bryant didn't get arrested. That their badges made them invincible. And for a moment, he still believed it. "You can't do this," he hissed, struggling against the bailiff's grip. "Do you know who I am?" Judge Williams stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "No," she said. "But after today, everyone will." The click of the handcuffs sealed his fate. Bryant's face twisted in disbelief as metal locked around his wrists. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. But what happens when a man who has never faced consequences finally meets justice? And what happens when the people who always protected him realize they can no longer save him? What happened that day in that courtroom was only the beginning. Because when the truth finally came out, no one was ready for it. and neither will you. Hey family. Before we dive into this powerful story, let's be clear about something. We stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and abuse of power. This is a space where we amplify voices, seek justice, and tell stories that matter. To every Black viewer watching, you are powerful, you are valuable, and you deserve respect. No one should ever be mistreated because of the color of their skin. Today's story is a reminder that justice always finds a way. So sit back, get comfortable, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a twist. What mattered wasn't the pain. What mattered was what came next. Officer Jonathan Bryant stood before her, his chest rising and falling in sharp, heavy breaths. His knuckles were still clenched, red from the impact of his unthinkable act. But more than that, his eyes flickered, not with regret, not with realization, but with something wild, something feral. And then, he smirked. It was slow, deliberate. A smirk that sent a wave of cold fury coursing through Judge Ian Williams' veins. The courtroom, once alive with shock and gasps, now teetered on the edge of chaos. The bailiffs had frozen, hesitant, uncertain, caught between their duty and their self-preservation. Attorneys whispered in frantic voices, their eyes darting between Ian and Bryant, waiting to see what would happen next. Ian exhaled slowly, controlling the fire burning in her chest. Keeping her voice as steady as the walls around her, she spoke with purpose. You think you can walk away from this? It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A fact. Because that's exactly what Bryant believed. His smirk deepened. Hello? Mocking chuckle left his lips, rolling over the courtroom like a dark storm cloud. I don't think, Judge. I know. And there it was. The core of his being, summed up in 3 words. Bryant had spent years doing as he pleased, stepping over lines, bending rules, wielding his badge like a weapon. And the worst part? He had never paid for it. Not once. Until now. Ian took one step forward. The shift in the room was immediate. The court reporters stopped typing. The attorneys stopped whispering. The bailiff snapped to attention, finally realizing, this wasn't going to end the way it always did. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the silence. Judge Williams. The chief bailiff. A man she had worked with for years. A man she trusted. A man who had always shown her respect. But now? Now, there was something else in his tone. A warning. Ian turned, locking eyes with him. And in that split second, she understood exactly what was happening. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at them. Bryant's fellow officers, men who had patrolled these streets with him. Men who were watching this unfold not with horror, not with shock, but with a quiet, simmering tension. They weren't waiting to see if Bryant would be held accountable. They were waiting to see if they needed to step in. To protect him. The realization hit Ian like a sharp, cold knife to the gut. They weren't concerned that Bryant had hit her. They were concerned about what she was going to do about it. For a long moment, she said nothing. She simply absorbed the truth that hung thick in the air, nearly suffocating. She had spent her entire life playing by the rules. But the rules had never protected her. And Bryant knew that. That's why he hit her. That's why he smirked. Because the rules weren't made to hold men like him accountable. Ian inhaled deeply. She was done playing their game. You just assaulted a sitting judge, she said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Bryant's smirk didn't waver. If anything, it grew. And then, he spoke. One word. So? The sheer audacity of it rang through the courtroom like a gunshot. Ayan knew exactly what she had to do. But not yet. Because Bryant had spent years believing himself to be untouchable. And now? She was going to make him feel it. She didn't shout. She didn't lash out. She didn't demand justice in a way that could be twisted, rebranded, used against her. She simply turned to the chief bailiff and spoke with chilling clarity. Clear the courtroom. A ripple of confusion spread. Attorneys exchanged glances. Reporters clutched their notebooks tighter. Even the bailiffs hesitated. Bryant let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Scared, Judge? Ayan didn't blink. I said, clear the courtroom. The chief bailiff hesitated, then nodded. One by one, people filed out. Some hesitated. Some stole glances over their shoulders, sensing that something bigger was about to happen. Bryant watched, first amused, then confused. Because she wasn't reacting the way he expected. He expected rage. He expected tears. What he wasn't expecting was calculated silence. Minutes passed. The courtroom emptied. The doors shut. And then, it was just them. Bryant. Ayan. The chief bailiff. And the officers who still stood, watching, waiting, unsure if they were supposed to protect him or let this happen. Ayan exhaled slowly, lifting her chin. Then, with deadly precision, she reached for her gavel. Bryant's smirk returned, but this time, there was unease beneath it. For the first time, he didn't know what was coming next. For the first time, he wasn't in control. And that, more than anything else, made the fear creep into his eyes. Ayan tapped the gavel once. Steady. Deliberate. Then she spoke. Officer Bryant. A pause. Then. You are under arrest. The silence was deafening. The weight of her words didn't just fill the air. It crushed it. Bryant's face twisted in disbelief. The chief bailiff stepped forward. And for the first time, Bryant took a step back. You can't do this. His voice was tight, sharp, but unsteady. Ayan didn't flinch. I already did. Bryant's jaw tightened so hard it looked like his teeth might break. His entire body went rigid, fighting the reality caving in around him. His voice dropped, barely more than a growl. You don't know what you're doing. Ayan stepped closer. You assaulted me in front of an entire courtroom. In front of officers. In front of cameras. Do you really think there's a way out of this? Bryant's chest rose and fell, his breath sharp and uneven. You think you can win against people like me? He hissed. Ayan tilted her head slightly. And yet, here we are. The chief bailiff reached for his wrists. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked shut. The doors swung open. And outside, the press was waiting. The flashes of cameras. The roar of reporters. The entire country was watching. And Officer Jonathan Bryant, the untouchable man, was now a headline. And it was only the beginning. The reckoning of Officer Jonathan Bryant. Life had taught Jonathan Bryant that men like him didn't fall. But today, he was falling. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The final clink echoed through the silent courtroom, carrying with it a truth Bryant wasn't ready to accept. He barely reacted at first. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, but his face, his expression, was locked in a state of stunned, immovable disbelief. His entire world had been built on the idea that this moment could never happen to him. There was always a way out. An excuse. A loophole. A favor to call in. But not today. Because as the press swarmed outside the courtroom doors, as the flashing cameras, the watching eyes, and the roar of reporters bore down on him, he realized there was no way out. The chief bailiff's grip tightened on his arm, guiding him toward the door. But Bryant dug his heels into the floor, stopping just short of stepping into the hallway. His breathing was uneven. His fingers twitched at his sides. His mind was racing, searching for something, anything, to reverse this nightmare. And then, he snapped. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath, just loud enough for Judge Ian Williams to hear. His voice was sharp, laced with pure, undiluted rage. His lips curled into a sneer, his body stiff, his chest heaving. "You think you won? You think they'll let this stand?" Ian didn't flinch. She didn't react. She simply watched him. And that enraged him even more. "I know people," Bryant continued, his voice dropping into something low and venomous, almost shaking with desperation. "You think the DA's office is going to let this go? You think the department is just going to sit back and watch one of their own get taken down by a..." He caught himself. But Ian knew exactly what he had been about to say. And he did too. The room held the silence between them like a blade poised in midair, waiting to drop. Ian finally spoke, her voice quiet but unshakable. "One of their own?" She let the words settle, watching as Bryant's throat bobbed, his composure fracturing. "And what exactly does that mean, Officer Bryant?" He didn't answer. Because they both knew what it meant. He had built his entire career on being protected. On being one of them. On knowing that no matter what he did, someone would always be there to clean up his mess. Until now. Ian took a slow step forward, closing the space between them just enough that her voice didn't need to rise, just enough that he could feel the weight of her words pressing into him like iron. "You walked into this courtroom believing you were untouchable," she said, her tone controlled, almost calm. But beneath the surface was something sharper. Something dangerous. "You struck a sitting judge, in front of witnesses, in front of officers, on camera." She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locked onto his. "And you still believe you can walk away from this?" Something inside him snapped. His body jerked forward, like he wanted to lunge at her. But the chief bailiff's grip tightened around his arm, yanking him back just as quickly. Bryant's breath was harsh, his pulse pounding, his chest rising and falling like he was trying to contain something explosive inside him. "You don't get to do this to me," he spat, his voice breaking. A thin thread of control snapped apart. "You think you're different? You think you matter?" His voice turned cruel, biting. "You're just another name they'll forget. Another headline. Another." Ian took another step forward. And this time, Bryant took a step back. He didn't even realize he had done it. The movement was instinctual. Like he was afraid. Like, for the first time in his life, he was the one being cornered. And the realization hit him all at once. Because that's what this was. He wasn't in control anymore. He wasn't the one holding the power. He wasn't the one people feared. He was just a man in handcuffs. A criminal. And the whole world was about to see him that way. Ian didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She didn't revel in the moment. Not because she didn't want to, but because this wasn't about her. This was about justice. The doors swung open. The first blinding flashes of cameras filled the room. Bryant tensed, his breath hitching as the noise erupted into the hallway. "Officer Bryant, do you have a statement?" "Judge Williams, how do you feel about the arrest?" "Bryant, is it true you have a history of excessive force?" The questions pummeled him from all sides. relentless, merciless. And then, the final blow. Somewhere in the crowd, a junior reporter for a major network had just uploaded the footage. The unedited, raw footage of Bryant striking Ian inside the courtroom. Within seconds, it was everywhere. Every screen. Every phone. Every television. Millions of eyes were watching. Judging. Reacting. And in real time, Bryant watched his own destruction unfold. The DA's office issued a statement within minutes, condemning his actions. The mayor's office distanced itself immediately. His own department released a statement. The matter will be investigated. But there was something cold about it. Something that made it clear, they weren't going to save him this time. And for the first time in his life, Bryant felt what it was like to be on the other side of the system he had spent years abusing. He felt the helplessness, the isolation, the realization that power was impermanent, that untouchable men could fall. Ian stood at the top of the courthouse steps, watching as Bryant was shoved into the back of a squad car. Maybe, for a moment, just a second, she expected him to say something. A final word. A final act of defiance. But he didn't. Because what was there left to say? The car door slammed shut. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. But men like Bryant didn't go down quietly. And the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The reckoning, the warning arrives. Ian's stomach dropped. The thick manila envelope sat on her front porch, its edges curled slightly from the night air. The dim glow of the streetlight barely illuminated it, but she felt the weight of its presence as if it were pressing against her chest. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been here. Someone had stood on her porch in the dead of night, leaving this message. And whoever it was, they hadn't wanted to be seen. She let the curtain slip back into place, gripping the fabric between her fingers as her mind raced through the possibilities. A warning? A threat? A piece of evidence? She exhaled sharply and stepped away from the window. This was a game of power, and she had already drawn her line in the sand. She wasn't backing down. So, she grabbed her phone and texted the only person she trusted with this kind of thing. Ian, 2:35 a.m. Get over here. Now. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, headlights cut through the darkness, the faint sound of tires crunching against the pavement. Detective Marcus Hale stepped out of his unmarked car, his sharp eyes scanning the area before making his way up her porch. She opened the door before he could knock. His gaze flicked to the envelope on the ground. "What the hell is that?" he asked, voice low. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I have a feeling I should." Marcus bent down, pulled on a pair of gloves, and picked up the envelope. It wasn't sealed, just folded over. He pried it open carefully, his jaw tightening as he pulled out a stack of papers, photographs, and a single flash drive. Ian's breath caught in her throat. The photographs. They were of Bryant. Not in uniform. Not in court. But in compromising situations. In places he shouldn't have been, with people he shouldn't have been with. Her stomach churned as she flipped through them. Some showed him exchanging envelopes of cash. Some captured him with known criminals, men she had seen in her courtroom before, men who were supposed to be on the department's most wanted lists. And then the last one. Bryant, standing in front of a woman, her face half turned toward the camera, bruises on her arms. A domestic abuse victim. And him. Smiling. Ian's grip tightened on the photo. "Jesus," Marcus muttered. Ian was stone still. This wasn't just bad, This was career-ending. This was jail time. This was the kind of evidence that could burn him to the ground. But who had sent it? She reached for the flash drive, but Marcus grabbed her wrist before she could plug it into her laptop. "Not here," he warned. "If this is what I think it is, you don't want to open it on a personal device. We do this at the station, with tech forensics watching." Ion stared at him. She knew he was right. But she also knew she wasn't waiting. She yanked her hand free and inserted the drive into a secure, offline laptop she kept for sensitive casework. Marcus let out a curse, but she ignored him. The files loaded. And the video popped up. Security footage. A dimly lit parking garage. A date stamped from 6 months ago. A woman backing away from Bryant, hands trembling, her eyes darting around for help that wasn't coming. He advanced on her, his face twisted in fury, his hand clenched into a fist. Then, a flash of movement. Another figure stepped into the frame. A man. The camera angle didn't give a clear look at his face, but he shoved Bryant back hard enough to make him stumble. There was no audio. But the body language was unmistakable. Bryant was furious. The man, whoever he was, wasn't afraid. Bryant said something. The man pulled something from his pocket. A badge. FBI. Ion's breath caught. Bryant hesitated. Then, he turned and walked away. Not because he wanted to, but because the other man had power. Marcus inhaled sharply. "That's an FBI agent." Ion nodded, eyes locked on the screen. Whoever this agent was, he had intervened. Stopped Bryant. But had done nothing else. No arrest. No charges. Nothing. And yet, someone had sent this to her now. Why? Marcus broke the silence. "This is a warning." Ion looked up. Or an invitation. By the next morning, Ion was sitting across from the man in the video. Special Agent Caleb Monroe. He was calm, collected, and entirely unapologetic about what he had done. "I stopped him," Monroe said, leaning back in his chair. "That's more than most people ever did." Ion folded her arms. "And then you let him walk." Monroe's gaze didn't waver. "Because if I hadn't, this would have disappeared before it ever saw the light of day." He wasn't just protected by the department, Judge Williams. He was protected by people a lot higher than that. Ion's blood ran cold. This was bigger than just Bryant. This was about the entire system that built him, that covered for him, that let him get away with everything. And now that system wanted to bury her. Monroe studied her. "I'm telling you this because you need to understand something. You're in the fight of your life. They're going to come at you from every angle. They're going to destroy your credibility, question your rulings, drag your name through the mud." He leaned forward. "They're going to try to erase you." Ion's hands clenched under the table. "Let them try." The moment Ion stepped onto the courthouse steps, a wall of sound hit her like a tidal wave. Reporters. Activists. Onlookers. The crowd stretched as far as she could see, an ocean of cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward, voices calling her name. "Judge Williams. What are your thoughts on the verdict? Do you believe this sets a precedent for future cases? How do you respond to those who say this was politically motivated?" The heat of the late afternoon sun pressed down on her, mixing with the electricity of the moment. Justice had been served. And the world was watching. But Ion didn't pause. She didn't raise a fist, didn't give them a moment of satisfaction. She had done her job. Now, it was time for the world to do theirs. She descended the courthouse steps, her heels clicking against the stone, her expression composed. Behind her, Bryant was being led out a different exit, his hands cuffed, his face blank with shock. For a man who had once strutted through hallways like he owned them, he looked small now. Insignificant. The press swarmed him, but the officers moved quickly, shielding him from the cameras as they shoved him into a waiting transport van. As the door slammed shut, a single chant rose from the crowd. No one is above the law. It started low, a ripple through the sea of bodies. Then louder. Stronger. Until it filled the entire square. Ion felt it settle deep inside her. This wasn't just about Jonathan Bryant. It was about all the others like him. The ones who had used their power to silence, to control, to destroy. The ones who had never thought the scales of justice would tip against them. Until today. She reached her car, gripping the handle for a moment before stepping inside. As the door slammed shut, she finally allowed herself to exhale. It was over. But at the same time, she knew it had only just begun. By 6 p.m., the entire country was on fire. News anchors dissected every second of the trial, playing Bryant's mugshot on repeat. Some called it justice. Some called it revenge. But no one could ignore it. The footage of Bryant striking Ion in open court had replayed millions of times, dissected from every angle. The press had dubbed it the slap heard around the nation. And in the days that followed, the consequences rippled outward like shockwaves. The police union issued a statement, condemning the verdict and calling it an attack on law enforcement. The mayor's office scrambled, issuing neutral statements about trust in the judicial system. Even the governor was forced to respond, promising a full review of police conduct statewide. But Bryant's department? They went silent. No press conferences. No public defense of him. Because they knew. If they stood behind him now, they'd burn with him. And behind the scenes, Ion knew. They were afraid. Because if Bryant could fall, then maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be the last. Ion didn't go home that night. She drove to a quiet spot by the river, letting the city lights reflect on the water. The file on Bryant sat in the passenger seat, staring at her. Her father's name still burned in her mind. She had spent years believing the system had simply failed him. But now, she knew the truth. It hadn't failed him. It had done exactly what it was designed to do. And Bryant? He wasn't an exception. He was a product of the machine. A symptom of something deeper, something uglier. Ion inhaled, then exhaled slowly. This was never just about Bryant. It was about fixing what was broken. Or tearing it down entirely. 2 days after the verdict, the final domino fell. Ion stepped into her office that morning to find an envelope on her desk. No postage. No markings. Just a name. Jonathan Bryant. She opened it, eyes scanning the contents. It wasn't a threat. It was a list of names. Officers. Judges. Politicians. Men and women who had covered for Bryant, protected him, erased his mistakes. And someone had sent it to her. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She hesitated, then answered. A low voice spoke. "You got my message." She gripped the receiver. "Who are you?" A pause. Then. "Someone who wants to see this fight through." The line went dead. Ion lowered the phone slowly, staring at the list in front of her. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because Bryant had been one man. And now, she had an entire system to bring down. She smiled. "Let's get to work." Michael's grip on Lila's tiny hand tightened, not in fear, but in quiet resolve. They had been alone for too long. No child should ever have to ask that question. He met her gaze, the cold bite of the Chicago winter pressing in around them. "No," he whispered. "You won't go back to the streets. Not ever." A long silence followed. Then, for the first time, Lila leaned into him. Not just for warmth, but for something deeper. Safety. Michael looked over at Leah, her small frame rigid, her fingers clutching his coat as though letting go meant losing everything. He recognized that look. It wasn't just hunger. It was survival. And suddenly, he knew. This wasn't just a case. This was his moment. His decision. And it would change all of their lives forever. By the time they reached Chicago Memorial Hospital, Michael had already made up his mind. But the system wasn't going to make this easy. As soon as the ambulance pulled into the bay, a hospital social worker was already waiting. A woman in her late 40s, dressed in an oversized wool coat, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. "Officer, we'll take it from here." Michael hesitated. Lila tightened her grip on his arm. Leah stepped closer. His stomach twisted. He'd seen this before. Kids like them, scared, broken, shoved into an overwhelmed system that didn't care enough to fight for them. "Where will they go?" he asked, his voice firm. The social worker barely looked up from her clipboard. "We'll place them in the system until we can find a suitable." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. Both girls flinched. He exhaled, lowering his tone. "These kids have been through hell. You're telling me they're going to some group home with strangers?" The woman sighed, adjusting her glasses. "It's temporary. We don't have many foster homes available right now, especially for sibling pairs." Michael's pulse spiked. "How long?" The social worker frowned. "We do what we can." That wasn't an answer. And Michael knew exactly what that meant. Weeks. Months. Maybe years. Separated. Forgotten. The system was supposed to protect them. But right now, it felt more like another kind of abandonment. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Michael turned back to Leah and Lila. Lila's tiny frame was half hidden behind him, her wide eyes searching his face. Leah stood still, her small jaw tight, as if she were bracing for another letdown. And that was it. That was the moment. Michael knew. There was no one else. No one fighting for them. No one willing to stand in the gap. Except him. He turned back to the social worker. "What if I take them?" The woman blinked. I'm sorry? I mean it. What if I foster them?" A pause. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then, she let out a short laugh. "Officer, this isn't a stray dog situation. You can't just pick up two kids off the street. They don't have anyone." His voice was steady. "And I do." The social worker hesitated, then sighed, flipping through her clipboard. "There's a process. A home study. Paperwork. And even if you qualify, then tell me what I need to do." She studied him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You really think you can handle two kids?" Michael didn't even hesitate. "No. But I know what it's like to be alone. And I'd rather fail trying than leave them to a system that doesn't care enough to." For the first time, Leah's expression cracked. She didn't say anything. But she looked at him like she wanted to believe him. The social worker sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's start with the paperwork." By the time Michael left the hospital, it was past midnight. The first steps were in motion. But nothing about this would be easy. He still had to get temporary guardianship. He still had to prove he was fit to take them in. And most of all, he had to convince Leah to trust him. As he drove through the empty city streets, his mind replayed everything. The cold. The hunger. The way Lila had clutched his arm like a lifeline. The way Leah had tried to shield her sister from the world, even at her own expense. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. These kids had been failed at every turn. And he'd be damned if he let them down, too. Because this wasn't just rescue. It was redemption. For them. For him. For a system that had left too many behind. A choice that changes everything. Michael knelt down so that his eyes were level with Leah's. "You don't have to be good," he said softly. "You just have to be kids." Leah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the tattered teddy bear in her lap. She had spent her whole life learning not to take up space, not to be a burden. To hear someone say she didn't have to prove herself? That was new. Lila looked up from where she sat beside her sister, her wide eyes flickering between Michael and Leah. "You said you wouldn't leave," Lila whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of hospital machines. Michael reached out, resting a hand gently on the bed between them. "And I meant it." Leah steadied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of hesitation. Any sign that he would walk away. She had seen too many adults come and go. Too many broken promises. But Michael didn't look away. He let her see it. The truth. He wasn't here because he had to be. He was here because he chose to be. Finally, slowly, Leah nodded. Not much. Just enough. And in that moment, everything changed. Michael barely had time to process the small victory before reality came crashing in. It started with a phone call. Not from Monica. From his captain. He saw the number flash across the screen and knew, deep in his gut, that this was about to get complicated. "Michael," Captain Dawson's voice was sharp, laced with something that felt an awful lot like warning. "I just got off the phone with social services. Do you want to tell me why they're saying one of my officers is trying to foster 2 homeless kids?" Michael exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I'm not trying, Cap. I am." A beat of silence. Then, "You realize what you're doing, don't you?" "I do." Dawson sighed. "Look, I get it. You've got a good heart. But you don't just pick up kids off the street and decide to be their guardian. The department is already stretched thin. The last thing we need is for you to get tangled up in a legal nightmare." Michael's jaw clenched. "They're not a legal nightmare. They're children. Children who are going to need home inspections, court approvals, and 100 other things you haven't thought through yet. And in case you forgot, you work for the city. You don't get to just change your life on a whim without it affecting the force." Michael knew what his captain was really saying. Don't do this. Walk away while you still can. But it was too late for that. So he said nothing. And that silence? It said everything. Dawson exhaled heavily on the other end of the line. "Michael, if you go through with this, you're putting yourself in a position that could compromise your career." Michael didn't hesitate. "Then I guess that's a risk I'll have to take." Another pause. "Then. You're really going to do this, aren't you?" Michael's gaze drifted back to Leah and Lila, the way Leah sat protectively beside her sister, the way Lila leaned into her warmth. "Yeah, Cap," he murmured. "I really am." The line went dead. And just like that, The next battle began. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind. Paperwork. Meetings. Interviews with social workers who looked at him like he was crazy. "You don't have any experience with children," one of them pointed out, flipping through his file. Michael crossed his arms. Neither did half the parents in this city before they had kids. The woman sighed. "Fostering isn't just about wanting to help, Officer Bennett. It's about structure. Stability. These girls have been through extreme trauma. They need more than good intentions." Michael leaned forward, his voice steady. "Yeah, they do. And I can give it to them." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she closed the file. "You'll have to go through the process like everyone else. Background checks. Home visits. Psychological evaluations. If you pass all of that, we can discuss temporary guardianship." "How long?" "Months. Maybe a year." Michael's stomach dropped. He didn't have a year. Leah and Lila didn't have a year. Every second they spent waiting for approval was another second where they could be sent somewhere else. Split up. Lost in a system that wasn't built to save them. He had to find a way. And he had to find it fast. The moment Monica finally called, Michael knew it wasn't to apologize. "Are you really going through with this?" she demanded, skipping the pleasantries entirely. Michael closed his eyes, already exhausted. "I don't need your permission, Monica." "No," she snapped. "But you do need to think about what this means for us. For our future." Michael knew. And it killed him. Because there was no us anymore. Not in the way she wanted. He had already chosen. And Monica knew that too. Her voice softened, just slightly. "Michael, I love you. But I don't want this life. I don't want the weight of it. If you do this, I don't think we can be together." Michael's throat tightened. He wanted to fight. To say something that would fix it. But there was nothing to say. Because she was right. She had always pictured a life with him. Just not this life. Not Leah and Lila's life. And if he asked her to stay, it would be cruel. So he didn't. Instead, he whispered, "Then I guess this is goodbye." And the line went dead. The next time Michael stepped into the hospital room, Leah and Lila were waiting. Lila sat cross-legged on the bed, hugging her teddy bear. Leah, as always, stood protectively in front of her. They both looked at him. And for the first time, he wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was the one person who stayed. Leah's voice was quiet. "Did they let you take us?" Michael knelt down, his hands resting on his knees. "Not yet." Lila's face fell. "But I'm going to fight for you," he added firmly. "For both of you." Leah's small fingers twisted in the hospital sheets. "Even if it's hard?" Michael smiled. "Especially if it's hard." And for the first time since he met them, Leah believed him. Michael stood at the doorway of the break room, listening as his colleagues spoke about him as if he weren't even there. "He's a cop, not a social worker," Daniel muttered. "Bringing in 2 kids out of nowhere? That's a disaster waiting to happen." Harris scoffed. "Not to mention he's single. How's he gonna raise them on his own? He's barely home as it is." Michael clenched his jaw, forcing himself to take a deep breath before stepping forward. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" The 2 men stiffened, their faces turning slightly red as they realized they had been caught. Harris gave a weak chuckle. "Come on, Mike. We're just talking. You can't seriously think this is a good idea." Michael crossed his arms. "Why? Because I want to help two kids who have no one else? Daniel shook his head. It's not about that. It's about reality. You know how this job works. You're always on call. Late shifts. Dangerous situations. How do you expect to raise two little girls in the middle of all that? Michael didn't hesitate. I'll figure it out. Harris let out a short laugh. That's not how parenting works, man. You can't just figure it out. You don't even know what you're getting yourself into. Michael's fists tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. You're right, he admitted. I don't know everything. But I do know one thing, those girls deserve better than the life they've had. And if I have to sacrifice a few things to make sure they're safe, then so be it. The room fell silent. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. You're a stubborn bastard, Thompson. Michael smirked. Yeah. And? Harris exchanged a glance with Daniel before shrugging. I just hope you know what you're doing. Michael didn't respond. Because the truth was, he didn't know. He was stepping into the unknown. But he also knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to let fear stop him. The next few weeks were a blur of court dates, social worker visits, and sleepless nights. Michael had always thought of himself as someone who could handle pressure. But nothing had prepared him for this. The home inspection was the first real hurdle. Mrs. Peterson arrived early one morning, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable as she stepped into Michael's small apartment. Michael had spent the past week scrubbing every surface, assembling furniture, and making sure everything looked perfect. The girls' room had been set up, 2 small beds with fresh linens, a nightlight, and a bookshelf filled with colorful children's stories. It wasn't a mansion, but it was safe. It was theirs. Mrs. Peterson walked through the space slowly, taking notes, occasionally glancing at Michael as if trying to gauge whether he was truly ready for this. Finally, she turned to him. You did all this yourself? Michael nodded. Yeah. She arched an eyebrow. You understand that raising children isn't just about providing them with a roof over their heads, right? It's about emotional stability. Consistency. You'll have to make sacrifices. Michael exhaled. I know. Mrs. Peterson studied him for a moment before nodding. We'll see. That was all she said before walking out. Michael wasn't sure whether that was a good sign or a bad one. But there was no turning back now. A few nights later, Michael was at the hospital with the girls when a familiar figure walked in. Monica. His chest tightened at the sight of her. She looked the same, elegant, composed, but guarded. He hadn't heard from her since their last phone call. Hey, he said cautiously. She gave him a small nod before glancing past him, her eyes landing on Leah and Lila. The girls were sitting on their beds, flipping through a picture book. Leah noticed Monica almost immediately, her small body tensing. Michael stepped forward, keeping his voice low. What are you doing here? Monica exhaled, rubbing her temple. I had to see it for myself. See what? She hesitated, then gestured toward the girls. You. This. The life you're choosing. Michael clenched his jaw. I'm not choosing anything, Monica. This isn't some impulsive decision. I know what I'm doing. She scoffed. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're throwing everything away. Michael's fists tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. What do you want me to say? That I'll walk away? That I'll pretend I never met them? Monica folded her arms. I want you to be realistic. Michael's voice was low but firm. Realistic is knowing that if I don't fight for them, no one else will. For the first time, Monica's expression softened. She looked at Leah, then at Lila, and for a split second, Michael thought maybe, just maybe, she understood. But then she took a step back. "I can't be part of this." Michael swallowed hard. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Monica sighed. "For what it's worth, I hope you prove me wrong." And with that, she turned and walked out of his life for good. Days turned into weeks. Michael passed every home visit, every psychological assessment, every background check. But still, the decision rested with the courts. And when the day finally arrived, he sat outside the judge's chamber, his leg bouncing anxiously as he waited for his case to be called. Inside the room, Leah and Lila sat beside a court-appointed representative. Michael could see the fear in their eyes, the uncertainty. And in that moment, he knew, no matter what happened, they were already his. Then, the doors opened. A court officer stepped out. "Michael Thompson?" Michael stood, his heart hammering. "The judge is ready to see you." This was it. The moment that would determine whether his fight was enough. Whether he was truly ready to be a father. He took a deep breath. And then he stepped inside. When his shifts ran late, ensuring they had someone familiar to rely on. She cooked meals for them, told them bedtime stories, and even taught them little lessons about kindness and patience. Leah, who was usually reserved around strangers, slowly warmed up to her, and Lila adored having someone to chat with during the day. Despite the support, challenges kept coming. One day, Michael received a call from social services. Someone had filed a complaint about his adoption. He arrived at the office tense, sitting across from Mrs. Peterson, who looked more exhausted than usual. "There's been a concern raised," she said carefully, watching his reaction. Michael's jaw tightened. "By who?" She exhaled, tapping a file on the desk. "An anonymous party." Michael clenched his fists. He already knew who it was. Monica. Or perhaps someone from the station who still thought a white cop had no business raising two black girls. "The complaint suggests that you're not fit to provide for the girls due to the nature of your work," Mrs. Peterson continued. "They claim you can offer a stable home environment and that the girls would be better off in a different placement." Michael exhaled sharply. "That's ridiculous. Leah and Lila are happy. They feel safe with me." Mrs. Peterson held up a hand. "I believe you. And so far, there's no legitimate reason to halt the adoption process. But an official investigation will be conducted." Michael swallowed back his frustration. "Fine," he said. "Do whatever you have to do. I have nothing to hide." And that was the truth. He wasn't just fighting for legal custody, he was fighting for the family he had built. For the next few weeks, every aspect of Michael's life was put under scrutiny. Social workers made surprise home visits, evaluating Leah and Lila's well-being. Court-appointed investigators interviewed his colleagues, trying to determine if his work made him an unfit guardian. Even his financial records were reviewed, ensuring he had enough savings to provide for two children. Through it all, Michael refused to back down. One evening, after another exhausting interview with social services, Michael returned home to find Leah sitting alone on the couch, knees pulled to her chest. "Hey," he said gently, setting his keys down. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, then whispered, "They're going to take us away, aren't they?" Michael felt his heart crack. He knelt in front of her, gripping her small hands. "Look at me," he said firmly. "No one is taking you away. No matter what happens, I will fight for you and Lila." Leah looked at him, uncertainty clouding her deep brown eyes. "Even if they say we have to go?" Michael's throat tightened. "Even then." She was silent for a long moment before finally nodding. That night, Michael lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how terrifying it must be for them, to believe that at any moment, they could be ripped from the only home they had ever felt safe in. He wouldn't let that happen. 3 months after taking Leah and Lila home, Michael stood in court for the final ruling. Leah and Lila sat beside him, small and quiet, their hands clasped together. Mrs. Peterson was there, along with social services representatives and Michael's lawyer. Across the room sat a representative from Child Welfare Services, the same department that had pushed for the complaint to be taken seriously. The judge, a stern-looking man with sharp features, flipped through the case file before addressing Michael. "Officer Thompson, the court acknowledges your dedication to the well-being of Leah and Lila," he said. "However, concerns have been raised regarding the stability of their future under your care." Michael's fingers tightened against his pant leg. "I understand those concerns, Your Honor," he said carefully. "But I can assure you, these girls are loved. They are safe. They have a home with me." The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. "Miss Peterson, as the assigned caseworker, what are your final recommendations?" Mrs. Peterson stood, glancing at Michael briefly before turning to the judge. "In my professional opinion," she said, "Michael Thompson has provided a nurturing and stable environment for Leah and Lila. The girls are happy, they are healthy, and most importantly, they have bonded with him in a way that is rare for children who have experienced trauma. I recommend that the adoption be finalized." Michael exhaled, tension rolling off his shoulders. But the judge wasn't done. He turned to the child welfare representative. "Do you have any objections?" A thin woman in a navy blue blazer stood. She cleared her throat, looking as if she had already lost the battle. "No, Your Honor," she admitted. "Our concerns have been addressed. We have no further objections." The final moments felt like an eternity. The judge flipped the last page of the file, nodded once, and then looked at Michael. "This court officially grants full legal custody of Leah and Lila to Michael Thompson." The words barely registered before Lila launched herself into Michael's arms, hugging him so tightly he thought his ribs might break. Leah held onto his sleeve, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, letting the relief sink in. They were his. For good. The day the adoption papers arrived, Michael placed them in a frame and hung them on the wall of their home, right beside the picture of the three of them together. Leah and Lila settled in more each day, slowly shedding the fears of their past. Leah no longer hid food under her pillow. Lila no longer woke up in the middle of the night crying. And Michael? He no longer wondered whether he was making the right choice. Because when he tucked them in at night, when he heard them laughing in the living room, when he saw the way they ran to him after school, he knew. He was exactly where he was meant to be. A new chapter begins. With Mrs. Johnson's help, Michael slowly settled into his role as a father. The kind elderly woman helped whenever his shifts ran late, ensuring Leah and Lila always had someone to look after them. She even taught Michael a few parenting tricks, from making simple snacks the girls loved to calming their nighttime fears. With her support, Michael grew more confident in his new role. Slowly, Leah and Lila began adjusting to their new lives. The shadows of their past didn't disappear overnight, but the fear that once clouded their eyes gradually faded, replaced by something Michael had waited so long to see: trust. One day, Michael returned home to find Leah teaching Lila how to write her name. Lila misspelled it, writing Leah instead of Lila, and Leah burst into laughter. The sound filled the small apartment, warm and unrestrained. It was the first time Michael had seen them laugh so freely. That night, as he tucked them into bed, Leah looked up at him with quiet sincerity. "Dad," she said softly. "We never thought we'd have a place to call home." Michael felt his heart tighten, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes. He leaned down and kissed her forehead gently. "No, Leah," he whispered. "I have to thank you. You and Lila have brought meaning into my life." And just like that, they became a family. A milestone moment. The morning Michael took Leah and Lila to their first day of school was a moment he would never forget. He woke up early, carefully packing 2 small lunch boxes with handwritten notes inside. "Dad is always proud of you." Leah, ever the protector, clutched Lila's hand tightly as they approached the school gates. But Michael saw the small tremor in her fingers. He knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can do this, Leah," he said, looking into her eyes. "I'll be waiting right here when school is over. We'll go home together." Leah held his gaze, fear flickering, hope fighting against doubt. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. "Yes, Dad," she whispered. Then, with hesitant steps, she led Lila through the doors, disappearing into the classroom. Michael stood watching them go, feeling both proud and anxious. He knew this was more than just a school day, it was the first step into a world where Leah no longer had to bear the weight of survival alone. Over the next few months, Leah and Lila blossomed. Lila, once timid, became a chatterbox, telling Michael about her art projects and the new friends she was making. She proudly pinned her first drawing to the fridge, a colorful picture of their family, Michael in the center, with Leah and Lila on either side, hand in hand. Leah, ever responsible, took on small household tasks, helping Michael tidy up and even reading bedtime stories to Lila. But Michael noticed something. Even as she grew more comfortable, Leah still carried hidden fears. She was too careful, always trying to be perfect, as if believing that one mistake could make everything disappear. One evening, after dinner, Michael noticed her washing the dishes with intense focus, her small shoulders stiff, her fingers gripping the plates too tightly. He called her over, sitting her down beside him. "Leah," he said gently, "you don't have to do everything perfectly." She was silent for a long moment. Then, in a barely audible whisper, she asked, "If we misbehave, will you send us away?" Michael's chest tightened. He pulled her into a firm, warm hug, pressing his chin against her soft curls. "Never, Leah," he said, voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to be perfect to be loved. I love you just the way you are." For the first time, Leah let herself believe it. After that night, she smiled more. She let Michael take care of her, instead of always trying to take care of everyone else. For the first time, Leah and Lila were finally just children, free to laugh, to make mistakes, to be loved without condition. At the police station, the initial whispers about Michael adopting 2 black girls had slowly died down. People saw his dedication, how he never missed a school recital, how he proudly carried Lila's drawings in his patrol car, how Leah lit up when he picked her up from school. One day, Sergeant O'Reilly, one of his toughest colleagues, approached his desk. He cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Thompson," he muttered, scratching his head. "I didn't think you could do it." Michael raised an eyebrow. "But you're a good dad," O'Reilly admitted gruffly. "I don't know anyone else who could do what you're doing." Michael nodded, feeling a weight he hadn't realized he carried lift from his shoulders. For the first time, he knew, he didn't have to prove himself to anyone anymore. Months later, the call finally came. Michael rushed to the social services office, heart pounding. Mrs. Peterson, the caseworker who had overseen the adoption, smiled warmly at him. "Officer Thompson," she said, sliding a file across the desk. "Leah and Lila are officially your daughters." Michael exhaled sharply, his hands shaking as he held the adoption papers. It was real. It was final. That night, he threw a small celebration at home. Mrs. Johnson came, along with a few of Michael's closest colleagues. Leah and Lila wore matching dresses, their eyes shining with happiness. In the middle of the party, Leah suddenly stood up. She looked at Michael, her brown eyes sparkling with emotion. "Dad," she said, voice soft but strong. "We used to think no one wanted us." She paused, swallowing hard. "But now we know, we have a family. And we're so grateful." Michael felt tears burn his eyes. He walked over, wrapping both girls in a tight embrace, his voice thick with love. "No, Leah," he whispered. "I'm the one who's grateful." Leah and Lila grew up surrounded by love. Michael taught them how to ride bikes, how to make pancakes on Sunday mornings, how to believe in themselves. Leah became a confident young girl, often starring in school plays, commanding the stage with her presence. Lila discovered her love for art, spending hours drawing colorful worlds, her imagination knowing no bounds. One night, as they all sat on the couch, watching old home videos, Leah turned to Michael. "Dad," she asked quietly, "are we tiring you?" Michael chuckled, pulling both girls closer. "You too," he said with a smile, "are everything to me." Leah and Lila hugged him tightly, laughing in the warmth of their home. And in that moment, Michael realized he hadn't just saved Leah and Lila. They had saved him. From a cold winter night in a dark alley to warm days filled with laughter, Michael, Leah, and Lila became a family not bound by blood, but by love. Because family isn't about DNA. It's about who shows up, who stays, who fights for you, no matter what. And Michael would spend the rest of his life proving to Leah and Lila that they would never, ever be alone again. The story of Michael, Leah, and Lila teaches us a profound lesson about the power of love, resilience, and the true meaning of family. It reminds us that family is not defined by blood but by the unwavering commitment to love and protect one another. Michael, a man who never expected to become a father, chose to step up when two helpless children had no one else. He didn't have to, but he listened to his heart, proving that sometimes, the most meaningful relationships in life come from the choices we make rather than the ones we are born into. One of the greatest lessons from this story is the importance of showing up for others, especially those in need. Leah and Lila had been abandoned, neglected, and left to fend for themselves in a world that had already been cruel to them. Society had failed them before Michael found them, and they had no reason to believe that anyone would truly care. But Michael showed them that not everyone turns away, that there are still people willing to fight for the most vulnerable, even when the journey is difficult. His actions reinforced the idea that compassion isn't just about feeling sympathy. It's about taking action to make a difference. Another powerful theme in this story is healing from the past and learning to trust again. Both Leah and Lila had built emotional walls, believing that love and security were temporary luxuries they would eventually lose. Leah, in particular, struggled with the fear that if she made a mistake, she would be abandoned once again. But Michael's patience, his constant reassurance, and his unconditional love slowly helped her let go of her fears. This teaches us that trauma doesn't heal overnight. But with love, consistency, and understanding, even the deepest wounds can begin to mend. Michael's journey also challenges societal biases and expectations. As a single police officer, he faced skepticism from colleagues and even from his own fiancée about his ability to raise two children, especially black children. Yet, he stood firm in his decision, proving that love transcends race, background, or circumstance. His story is a reminder that the best families are built on love, not societal norms or prejudices. Lastly, the story highlights that acts of kindness, no matter how small, can change lives. If Michael had walked past that alley without stopping, Leah and Lila's fate might have been entirely different. It shows us that sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't require grand gestures, just the willingness to care, to step forward, and to offer a helping hand. In the end, Michael didn't just save Leah and Lila, they saved him, too. They gave him a purpose, a family, and a love that he never expected. Their story is a testament to the idea that when we open our hearts to others, we not only change their lives but also discover new meaning in our own. The world needs more people like Michael, people who are willing to choose love, even when it's not the easiest path. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Sparkles. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you take away from this powerful journey? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you want more inspiring stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that matter. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Let's build a community of people who believe in hope, love, and second chances.